Hello all and welcome to this course on pre-business school statistics. So we are entering the second session of this course. So again, just to very briefly talk about what we covered in the last section. So last section was more like an introduction where we talked about history of statistics, tabulated data, the two schools of thought which are descriptive statistics, inferential statistics, and right towards the end I sort of stopped by giving some examples. Okay? Or rather today's session will focus more on sampling. I mean, how should one collect a sample or rather a suitable sample, and different kinds of data types, again if time permits. Okay. Now again, if you remember very briefly, even the last session we talked about that the importance of collection of a suitable sample is all the more important, because ultimately since you are unable to sort of create or visualize the entire population being very large, we sort of collect a sample from the population. Okay. So whatever data you collect is nothing but the sample and not the population. But again, remember that the end goal always is to analyze or draw some conclusions about the overall population. Okay, so I think again just a couple of definitions regarding the two branches we talked about even in the first session. So types of statistics, on first hand we have descriptive, on the second hand we have inferential. So what do you mean by descriptive? So it sort of provides a visual, tabular or numeric summary of large amounts of data to explain its key characteristics. So again threefold, so visual, where you can create some graphs such as pie charts, box plots, histograms, frequency charts, scatter plots, etc. Or it can be tabular, where you sort of have a table containing columns of average values, medians, etc. Or numeric summaries, or simply find out average, mean, median, mode, percentiles, etc. of large amounts of data to explain its key characteristics. Okay. So couple of points there. So identify patterns in large amounts of data is the first thing, and data set is assumed as stand alone. So whatever data you collect, unfortunately you do actually work with that data. So you cannot change the data once you collect that. Okay. So keep this very important point in mind, and hence collection of data is all the more important. So the way you collect data, the observations you collect or the sample that you form initially becomes all the more important. Okay. But on the other hand, what is inferential? So inferential uses a sample of data. So once you collect a data, it's called as a sample of data. So inferential uses a sample of data to make inferences or conclusions about the general population. So again, couple of points. So assumes that sample is representative of a larger population. We've talked about in the last session also that whatever sample you collect has to be representative of a much larger population which you are trying to analyze down the line. Okay. And draws conclusions about population based on smaller samples. So ultimately, how do you connect a smaller sample which you collect to the larger population is important. Alright, now the pressing question is what kind of inferences can we make in statistics? Okay. So these are some examples. For example, we can estimate some unknown population parameters based on properties of a sample, right? And this entire school of thought is called as estimation. So how do you estimate some unknown population parameters based on certain properties of, let's say, a smaller sample or the set of data which you have collected? Okay. And again continuing, right. So first idea is estimation. So estimating some unknown parameters of the population from the sample which you collect. Or what can you do? You can sort of test a hypothesis about a population, right? And this branch is called as hypothesis testing. So first branch, which you see, the first point is called as estimation, which is this one, and the second point is called as hypothesis testing. Okay. So now the very important idea is we'll sort of very briefly introduce the concepts of a sample and a population, because again, like I said, just to reiterate one last time, is collection of a sample is very, very important. And how do you sort of connect the dots and then sort of create the chain from sample to the population? Now what we'll do is we'll talk in terms of examples. I'll give you a couple of examples of populations, and then I'll give you one very small task. So task, of course we can't do it live, but you can pause the video and then try to answer the question. Okay. So we'll see the first example of a population. So let's say all applications received for credit cards from a certain bank, let's say XYZ. Okay. Now you can pause the video for a second and ask you a simple question that for this population statement or for this example of a population, can you tell me an example of a suitable sample? Okay. So assuming that this is the population example, or this is the overall population which you want to analyze down the line. But of course, so can you see the problem here, that one can't analyze each and every application of all the credit cards from bank XYZ. So what do? You collect a smaller sample. Okay. So in that regard, can you sort of pinpoint to one suitable sample coming out of this population? Alright. Or the second example, let's say all consumers of product X. So again the same question. You have to pause the video and then try to think that can you sort of form or create a suitable sample coming out of this population. Okay. So we see the answer. So of course these are not exhaustive. Your answer might be slightly different from what you see in the slides. But again, so talking for the first point here, one sort of a sample could be, let's say, all the applications received in just the last 3 months. And of course, why is this a sample? Of course, it's a subgroup of the population, right? So the bigger population contains all applications for credit cards from bank XYZ, but in the sample definition or sample example, you're only focusing on the applications received in the last 3 months. Okay. Or for that matter, let's say if you think that this is the population, all consumers of product X, and then we can actually have a really focused sort of a sample where women consumers over the age of 45 who have bought the product X in the last 6 months. So this could be a suitable sample to begin. Alright, now the pressing question is, why do we need to separate the two? Right? I mean, can't we simply analyze the entire population? Again, the answer is no. We've talked about this extensively in the last session also. And if you remember a couple of pointers from last session, and why is the answer no? Because the population is large. Many of the entities might be unknown in the population, right? And exactly for these reasons, you require to collect a smaller subset and then try to analyze that. Yeah, so population tends to be very large, making it difficult or almost impossible to collect and analyze data for the entire population. And it's always easier to take a subset of the population, analyze that subset, and then make inferences about the unknown population. There. So now the second point actually depends on a very fundamental assumption which is called as representativeness, right? And we spent some time even in the first session talking about representativeness. So what does it mean actually is that whenever you collect a sample, you have to actually ensure that the sample is representative of the unknown population, or the sample is representative of the larger population or the larger universe. Okay. So and why do we require representativeness? The idea is very easy. So let's say if you have some information about the population, right, you can take a very simple problem of, let's say, finding out the average height of all the students in your college. Okay. Again, just to repeat, so let's say your end goal is to find the average height of all the students in your college. Okay. Now, of course, what is the population here? So again, you can pause the video and think. So what exactly is the population? The population is, or rather population contains all the students in your college, right? And now a very simple idea is that since you can't go to each and every student in your college because the number of students can be very large in thousands, right? So what you do, you collect a subsample of them. So you collect a smaller group of students, and then what you do, you try to analyze that smaller group. Okay. Now remember one thing, that on one hand you have the collection of all the students in the college, on the other hand you have a smaller collection of whichever smaller group of students you have collected. Now don't you think that the smaller group should be representative of the larger population? The answer is yes, right? Otherwise, if the smaller group has no characteristics which are seen in the population, then again all the analysis would fail eventually. Okay. So idea of representative is kind of very important when it comes to collecting a suitable sample. So we have to find a sample which is representative of the population that it belongs to. So again, let's say imagine you have a population of 10,000 respondents to a survey and you want to take a sample of 500. Alright, so population size is how much? Population size is 10,000, and then sample size. So we have a term called a sample size. So sample size refers to how many entities are there in the sample. Okay, so in this case 500 is my sample size, 10,000 is the population size. Okay. So again, just to repeat, imagine you have a population of 10,000 respondents to a survey and you want to take a sample of 500. So firstly, how many samples are possible? So what do you think? 20, 500, or 10,000 choose 500, or rather 10,000 see 500. So the correct answer is this, right? I mean, out of 10,000 respondents, you are collecting a subset of 500 respondents. Okay. And then 10,000 choose 500 is clearly a very large number. Okay, so clearly many samples are possible. And again the question would be, so will all these samples be good or representative samples? Of course not, right? So answer is no. So obviously each and every sample in this list, 10,000 choose 500, may not be equally good. Some of the samples would be slightly preferable, some of the samples might be garbage, right? Garbage means they are not making any sense of the population. So anything can happen. I mean, since this number itself is so large, right? So of course one can't analyze each and every possible sample. Okay. So what we do? So we have to actually ensure that the sample that we pinpoint to, a single sample that we pinpoint to containing 500 respondents, is representative of the population. Okay. Alright, so hence we can choose many samples from a population. However, a good sample is that which is chosen keeping these three key characteristics or points in mind. So the sample should be without bias, without any bias, full coverage. So I guess full coverage points more to representativeness. So I'll just write down REP, representativeness idea, and non-responsive inclusive. Okay, so the whichever sample you collect should be totally unbiased. Unbiased means that the experimenter should not prefer a particular society or prefer any group of students in the earlier example, and so on. Okay, so sample which you collect should be without any bias. It should be representative, full coverage, and non-response inclusive. So non-response inclusive means that there might be some respondents who fill in the survey nonsensically, or for a lot of questions there might be some missing responses from the respondents, right? So your sample should actually account for all these problems also. Okay, so without bias means what? So not choosing only high income respondents. So let's say again, like I said, if the experimenter should not pinpoint or rather be biased towards a particular group of respondents, for example high income respondents. Full coverage means what? All the segments in population are correctly represented. So idea of representativeness, like I said. And non-response inclusive means if 20% of the population are defaulters, your sample ideally should also have 20% defaulters. So from the overall population, if 20% of the population are defaulters towards, let's say, some loan or some property, some characteristic, then you should always include kind of an equal number of percentage of defaulters in the sample also. Okay. So ultimately behavior of the sample should be like the behavior of the population. Okay. So if you have to keep all the characteristics in mind, then how should one collect the sample? Okay. So one very easy idea, or rather the best way to pick a representative sample, is by picking sample elements at random. And you might have heard about this term which is called as random sampling, right? So random sampling means exactly that. So again, in the students' height example in your college, so what you can do is, let's say, since we argued that you can't go to each and every student in the college and ask his or her height, but rather what you should do is collect a group of students which is called as a sample, and you can actually do this exercise randomly. So one fine day you can actually roam in the college campus and then randomly pick some students and ask their heights. Okay, and this entire exercise is called as random sampling because you're not preferring any group. Right, and then still you're trying to be as representative as possible. Okay, and in this regard we can actually mention two very important kinds of sampling which are quite standard. So ultimately the question is that how do we collect a sample, or how do we select a sample? So essentially at random, but even inside that you have two different schools of thought. So on one hand you have simple random sampling, which we just talked about. Then without thinking about any properties, any characteristics, you roam inside the college campus, you randomly pick, let's say, 100 students, 200 students, depending on whatever sample size you fix, right? And then ask about their heights, all right? And on the other hand, you have another kind of a sampling which is called a stratified random sampling. So we'll talk about what do you mean by stratified random sampling. But again, for the first one, simple random sampling is that all the members in the population have an equal chance of being selected in the sample. Right? So do you think this would happen? Answer is yes, because if you roam in the campus and then basically ask students' height randomly, then each and every student which is present in the campus at that time point has an equal chance of being entered in your sample. Okay. Now stratified. So stratified, what do you mean by stratified? So the term stratified contains strata. So strata means what? Strata means different levels, right? So you're dividing something into different groups or different categories. Okay. So assume that for the same example, let's say students coming from, let's say, different engineering branches, civil engineering, CSE, electrical, mechanical, etc. And there might be students coming from different, let's say, ethnicity backgrounds, different age groups, right, different genders, etc. So if you think that, okay, so if the problem is again to find out the average height, it might be possible that a certain group's height might be slightly different from certain another group. So in this regard, what you can do is you can kind of divide the entire population into those groups. So let's say, just to take a simple example, you divide all the students in your college into, let's say, males and females. So if you feel that, okay, the average height of females might be slightly lower than the average height of males, so initially itself you can actually divide the population into males and females, and then suitably collect random samples within both groups. Okay, and then suitably collect samples, or rather random sampling, you can apply a random sampling within males and within females. So simple example in this regard could be, let's say, in your college, if you think that, okay, so 70% male students and 30% might be female students. Okay, so 70% are male students, 30% are female students. So what you can do is, if you have these rough ballpark figures in your mind, you can actually divide the sample or the population accordingly. Okay, so in your sample you can actually collect data from 70% males and 30% females. Okay, so if you fix the sample size to be, let's say, n equal to 100, so you're going to ask students' heights from 100 students. So you can actually ensure that after collecting data from 70 males, you stop and then proceed to collect data from 30 females. And why is that? Because this would be representative. Okay, otherwise if you simply roam randomly in the campus and collect data, it might turn out that you're collecting data all from males, right, and very few females are there in the sample, which we don't want, right, because from this statistics we know that 30% are still females. Okay, so even though the number of males in the college might be higher, 70%, but you want to be as representative as possible, and this could be achieved using stratified random sampling. So population members are first divided into groups or strata based on meaningfulness. Okay, so in this example, meaningfulness is nothing but gender, and then random samples are then taken within each strata. Okay, so probably down the line we'll talk about some examples, again coming from, let's say, simple random sample, stratified sampling, so things would be slightly more clear. Okay, but hopefully the basic idea, or rather basic difference between SRS, so SRS is the first one, and the stratified sampling should be clear. Alright, so ultimately what is the conclusion? So while building a sample, remember representativeness always. We assume that the sample represents the population, so any inferences you draw about the sample will be true of the population. Okay. Alright, now the second half of the session will talk majorly about data types. So what do you mean by data type? So again, remember that the first point is collecting the data. Okay. And once you collect the data, you have to actually ensure, or rather make sense of the data. So second step is making sense of the data. Okay, so data collection is what we talked about in the first half. So how should you sample? So should you go for random sampling? Should you go for stratified sampling? Right. So this part you have to actually fixate in the beginning. But once you collect the data, then we can actually talk about its data type. So and here you see two data types. So first one is numerical, second one is categorical. Okay. So whatever sample you collect or whatever observations you collect can be of one of these two groups. So the observations can be either numerical or they can be categorical. So numerical can be further broken down into two categories: discrete data and continuous data. Okay. So we'll spend some time on what you mean by each and every one of these. So again, remember that we are only focusing on numerical as of now, the first part. So numerical data type can be further broken down into discrete data and continuous data. So we'll talk about continuous very soon. But what do you mean by discrete data? Discrete data means observations which can be mapped to the set of integers. Hence, any count data is discrete. So any set of observations which you can count using your hand or fingers. Okay. So can you think of some examples? So you actually see three examples in front of you. So in that regard, number of anything comes under discrete data. So number of telephone calls, number of people at a station, number of accidents at a location during last month, right? So all these examples are examples of discrete data because you actually count them, right? Because number of telephone calls can be mapped to the set of integers. You can actually count them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and so on. Similarly, number of accidents, number of people at a railway station, right? Number of insects in a field, right? Number of people belonging to, let's say, high income group. So number of anything or other count data. So hence I wrote down count data is an example coming from a discrete data. Okay. And on the other hand, numerical can be further broken down to continuous data. So anything which is not discrete belongs to continuous data. So continuous means what? The observations can take decimal values also. Let's say 4.1, 4.3, 5.2, etc. So the examples we see in the last slide, so number of telephone calls, number of insects, can they take decimal values? Answer is no, right? And hence those data belong to discrete data, whereas any data set or any set of observations which can also take decimal values belongs to a heading or rather subheading of continuous data. So these could be some examples: temperature, weight, salary, rainfall. So temperature can also be 43.4 degrees, right, or 37.8 degrees. Similarly, weight. So weight can be 80 kilos and let's say 200 grams. Or salary. Salary can also take decimal values. So 10,000 rupees and 50 paisa. Rainfall. So rainfall can also take decimal values. So 70.7 millimeters, something like that. Okay. So all these are valid examples of data sets belonging to continuous category, while the ones we saw in the previous slide fall under discrete category. Okay. So again, just to repeat, numerical can be broken down into discrete and continuous. And now what we'll talk about next is, again, let me go back a couple of slides. We had made these two demarcations, right? So on the first hand you have numerical, on the other hand you have categorical. Okay. So even inside categorical we can actually have two more demarcations. So let me write down here. So first one could be nominal and second one is ordinal. Okay. So within numerical we talked about two demarcations, discrete and continuous. We talked about those examples. And again, within categorical one can actually pinpoint to two different kinds of data types. First one is nominal, second one is ordinal. So what do you mean by nominal? So nominal means any categories. Firstly, understand what you mean by categorical. So categorical means any data type which does not involve numbers, okay, which only involves some levels or categories and so on and so forth. All right. And even within categories I can have nominal and ordinal. So nominal means any set of categories which cannot be ordered or which cannot be ranked. Okay. So simple example could be, let's say, gender. So gender could be something like male versus females, right? So males and females does not involve numbers, so hence is not numerical, but data type is categorical. Okay. And even within males and females you can't rank them. So you can't say that males are above or females are above, something like that. Okay. Any other example? So gender could be one example. Second example could be, let's say, hair color. So people having different hair colors, black, brown, blue, grey, whatever, white, etc. Right. So hence the kinds of colors are still categories, right, and hence it belongs to categorical, but again you can't rank them. So you can't say that black is above brown or above grey and so on and so forth. Okay. So such examples which does not contain numbers are still categorical data type which you cannot rank. Okay. And on the other hand you have certain categorical data types which you can actually rank them. So one example could be, let's say, ranks in something, right? So ranks in karate. Okay. So let's say black belt, brown belt, green belt, blue belt, etc. So once you have all these colors, so even though colors are categorical, you don't have any numbers in them, and on top of that you can actually rank them. Okay. Or whenever you create some survey questions where you're asking some responses from the respondents, like let's say brand preference. Okay. So brand preference could be ordinal, because let's say brand preference could be, let's say, if you present a brand and if you're asking the sample to rank the preference. So let's say would you buy that in the future? So some responses would be very likely, somewhat likely, not at all likely, right? So all these come under, let's say, ordinal and within categorical. Okay. So hopefully by this time the idea should be clear that any data type can be demarcated into two broad categories, numerical and categorical, and even within categorical it can be broken down to nominal, ordinal, and within numerical it can be broken down into discrete and continuous. Okay. Now again, just to sort of summarize as to why all these exercises is important, again, like I said, the entire statistical analysis goes in a chain, or you have number of steps in that. The first step is to collect data, and collect data how? So collect data suitably, and hence we discussed two different kinds of sampling techniques, random sampling and stratified sampling, and we gave some examples where if you roam in the campus, again the same example of talking about heights of students. If you roam in the campus randomly and you collect data from random group of students, it falls under random sampling. But for that matter, if you have in your mind that 70% are males, 30% are females, and you think that okay, so my end goal is what? End goal is focusing more on the heights of students. So it might turn out that heights of males might be slightly higher than heights of females. And then for that matter, you have to again subdivide the sample into two categories. So 70% males, 30% females. But now unfortunately you can't conduct a random sample, right? Because if you roam in the campus and collect data from random group of people, it might turn out that in your sample size of 100, let's say 90 are male, 10 are female, which you don't want, right? And why? Because you want representativeness. So then what you do? You stratify. You apply stratified random sampling. You ensure that 70%, 30% percentages are rough about met, right? And then this exercise is called a stratified random sampling. Okay. And then the third step is once you collect the data, you have to actually make sense of the data, right? So for that matter, you would actually know as to what data type each and every observation belongs into. For example, heights of students. So height is what kind of a data type? You can pause the video and try to answer. So height is what data type? So far we've collected or talked about 4 data types, right? So discrete, continuous, nominal, ordinal. Okay, so height belongs to numerical firstly because it involves numbers, right? So height cannot be categorical. Okay, so height is numerical in the first place. And would it be discrete or continuous? So can height only take integers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? Answer is no, right? So height can be, let's say, 5 feet, 4 inches. It can go beyond that also. Okay, so hence the correct data type is height is numerical and continuous. So once you identify the data type, things are slightly more easier when you go down the line to model that or draw some descriptives and so on. Because remember one thing, so you have some sort of descriptive statistics which can only be applied to categorical data. Or on the other hand, you have some sort of descriptive stats which can only be applied to numerical data. Okay, so if you characterize a categorical data type as numerical or vice versa, then things would fail. Okay. Alright, so now in the next session we'll try to involve some idea about, let's say, probability, very basic set theory if time permits, and then eventually we'll enter into some very basic distribution theory, hypothesis testing, regression and so on. Okay. Thank you.